The morning mist clung to the ancient pines of Thornwick Forest like funeral shrouds, and Professor Wren Morven couldn't shake the feeling that something in the woods was watching them. She adjusted her shoulder bag, heavy with recording equipment, and glanced back at her two companions as they navigated the narrow deer path that locals claimed hadn't been used in over a century. "Keep the camera steady, Cassius," she called to the lanky young man struggling with the professional video equipment. Cassius Knightwood was her most promising film student. Ambitious, technically gifted, but perhaps too eager to capture something extraordinary for his senior thesis. Behind him, Sage Brennan carried the audio equipment, her dark hair pulled back severely as she monitored sound levels through oversized headphones. The three graduate students from Blackmore University had come to document the legend of the Thornwick Crone, a story that had persisted in the rural communities surrounding the forest for over 300 years. Local folklore spoke of a woman named Cordelia Ravenhurst who had fled into these woods in 1692, accused of witchcraft during the hysteria that had swept through the region like wildfire. Unlike the victims in Salem, Cordelia had escaped the hangman's noose, but according to legend, something far worse had claimed her in the depths of Thornwick Forest. "Are you getting this?" Wren asked, gesturing to the gnarled trees that seemed to twist into impossible shapes. Some locals claimed these formations weren't natural, that Cordelia had warped the very wood with her malevolent presence, creating a labyrinth designed to trap the unwary. The trees bore strange markings too, spirals carved deep into bark, symbols that predated any known indigenous writing system in the region. Cassius nodded, panning his camera across the disturbing landscape. Through his viewfinder, the forest looked even more ominous. Shadows seemed deeper, movements in his peripheral vision more frequent. "The light's really weird in here," he muttered. "It's like the trees are absorbing it." They had been hiking for 3 hours, following directions given by an elderly woman named Morrigan Ashworth, who lived on the forest's edge. She had been reluctant to speak about the Thornwick Crone at first, but Wren's academic credentials and persistent questioning had eventually loosened her tongue. The woman's final words echoed in Wren's mind. "She's still in there, you know, waiting. The forest doesn't give up its dead, it just changes them." As they pushed deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The normal sounds of forest life, birdsong, rustling small animals, even insects, gradually faded until they walked in unnatural silence. Sage kept adjusting her equipment, frowning at readings that made no sense. "I'm picking up some kind of interference," she reported. "Low-frequency vibrations, almost like singing, but there's no visible source." The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when they discovered the clearing. It opened before them suddenly, a perfect circle of dead earth surrounded by trees that leaned inward at impossible angles, their branches interwoven overhead like arthritic fingers. In the center stood a ring of 7 standing stones, each about 4 feet tall and covered in the same spiral symbols they'd seen carved into the trees. "Jesus," Cassius whispered, his camera capturing the eerie tableau. "When did you say this Cordelia woman lived?" "Late 1600s, Wren replied, approaching one of the stones. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe under her gaze, making her feel dizzy. "But these stones, they look much older. Pre-Columbian, maybe even prehistoric." Sage had set up her recording equipment and was staring at her instruments in confusion. "Wren, you need to hear this." She handed over the headphones, and Wren's blood ran cold at what she heard. Beneath the static was a sound like distant voices, women's voices, chanting in a language that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to some primitive part of her brain. "That's impossible," Wren breathed. "There's no one else out here." But as they stood in the clearing, shadows began to move between the trees. Not the quick darting of animals, but slow, deliberate movements that suggested human forms just beyond the edge of vision. Cassius spun his camera toward the tree line, but whenever he focused on a particular spot, there was nothing there. "We should document everything we can and get out," Sage said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "This place feels wrong." They spent the next hour recording footage and audio, taking measurements of the stone circle, and documenting the bizarre carved symbols. But as afternoon faded toward evening, their equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Camera batteries drained despite being fully charged. Audio recordings produced only static when played back. Even their GPS unit stopped working, showing their location as a blank void. "We need to head back," Wren decided, but when they tried to retrace their steps, the forest had changed. Paths that had been clear on their way in now led to impassable thickets. Trees seemed to have moved, blocking routes they distinctly remembered taking. The carved symbols appeared on more and more trunks, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. As darkness fell, they were forced to make camp in the cursed clearing. None of them wanted to spend the night there, but the alternative, wandering lost through Thornwick Forest in pitch darkness, seemed even worse. They built a small fire at the center of the stone circle, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the carved symbols seem to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. "Tell me about the legend again," Cassius said, his camera still rolling despite the failing light, "about what happened to Cordelia Ravenhurst." Wren pulled her jacket tighter against the growing cold. According to the stories, she was a midwife and herbalist who lived on the outskirts of what's now Millbrook. When the witch hysteria started, she was accused of practicing maleficium, harmful magic. They said she could curse livestock, spoil milk, and cause miscarriages. When the constables came to arrest her, she fled into these woods. "And then?" Sage prompted, though her attention remained focused on her equipment, which was producing increasingly disturbing sounds. "The search party found evidence that she'd built some kind of shelter in here, but Cordelia herself was never seen again. However, people started reporting strange encounters in the forest. Hunters would find their prey arranged in ritualistic patterns. Children who wandered too close to the woods came back changed, mute, distant, with knowledge they shouldn't possess, and women who ventured in alone." Wren's voice trailed off as something moved in the darkness beyond their campfire. It was definitely human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, limbs bent at unnatural angles. When Cassius swung his camera toward it, the figure melted back into the shadows. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before anyone could respond, Sage's equipment erupted with sound. The chanting voices they'd heard earlier, but much louder now, accompanied by what sounded like screaming. The audio was so intense it seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was giving voice to centuries of trapped anguish. That's when they saw her. Cordelia Ravenhurst stood at the edge of the firelight, and she was nothing like the historical records had suggested. 3 centuries in Thornwick Forest had transformed her into something that was no longer entirely human. Her body was elongated, stretched like taffy, with limbs that bent in too many places. Her hair had grown into root-like tendrils that seemed to connect her to the trees themselves. But her eyes still held traces of the intelligent woman she had once been, now overlaid with an alien hunger that made Wren's skin crawl. "You've come to learn about me," Cordelia said, her voice a whisper that somehow carried clearly over the crackling fire. "To document my story. But you don't understand what story you're actually telling." Cassius kept his camera trained on her, though his hands shook so badly the image was barely usable. "We're students," he managed. "We're just trying to preserve the local folklore." Cordelia laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Folklore? Is that what you think this is?" She gestured to the stone circle around them. "This place is older than your civilization, older than any human memory. The stones were here when I arrived, calling to me, teaching me truths that your species isn't ready to understand." Wren found her voice, though speaking felt like pushing words through molasses. "What kind of truths?" "That reality is thin here, that the boundaries between what is and what could be are permeable. The people who called me a witch were right, but they had no idea what witchcraft actually means." Cordelia took a step closer, and the fire dimmed, as if her presence absorbed light itself. It means learning to see the patterns that connect all things. It means understanding that consciousness isn't confined to a single body or a single timeline. As she spoke, more figures emerged from the darkness, women of different eras, all bearing the marks of Thornwick Forest's transformation. Wren recognized some of them from her research. Hikers who had disappeared over the decades, campers whose bodies were never found, researchers like themselves who had come seeking answers and found something far more dangerous. They joined me willingly, Cordelia explained, reading the horror in their faces. Once they understood what I was offering, freedom from the limitations of linear existence, the ability to perceive reality as it truly is, a web of interconnected possibilities, all existing simultaneously. Sage was backing away from the fire, but there was nowhere to go. The transformed women formed a circle around the stone ring, their eyes reflecting the firelight, like a pack of predators. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. "I want to show you what you really came here to document," Cordelia replied. "Not a folklore tale, but the birth of something new. Humanity is evolving, whether it realizes it or not. Consciousness is expanding beyond the boundaries of individual minds. And places like this, thin places where reality is malleable, are the laboratories where that evolution is tested." Wren felt something pulling at her mind, a subtle pressure that made her thoughts feel loose and disconnected. "The women who disappeared, you're saying they chose this? See for yourself." Cordelia gestured, and suddenly Wren could perceive the forest as the transformed women did. Time folded in on itself, showing her past and future simultaneously. She saw the stone circle as it had been millennia ago, when other species had used it for purposes she couldn't begin to comprehend. She saw potential futures where humanity had transcended its current limitations, existing as pure consciousness unfettered by biological constraints. But she also saw the price of that transcendence. The women surrounding them were no longer entirely human, their minds fragmented across multiple timelines, their bodies sustained by the forest's dark vitality. They had gained cosmic awareness at the cost of everything that had made them who they were. "No," Wren gasped, fighting against the mental intrusion. "This isn't evolution, it's parasitism. You're not teaching us to transcend humanity, you're destroying it." Cordelia's expression shifted, becoming something almost like disappointment. "Ah, you're not ready. I had hoped, given your academic background, that you might understand. But you're still trapped in linear thinking, still clinging to the illusion of individual identity." The pressure in Wren's mind intensified, and she could feel her sense of self beginning to dissolve. Beside her, Cassius had stopped filming, his camera hanging forgotten as he stared with vacant eyes at something only he could see. Sage was on her knees, her equipment scattered around her as she clutched her head and whimpered. "Don't fight it," Cordelia advised. "The transformation is less painful if you don't resist. You'll join a collective consciousness that spans centuries, a network of awareness that exists beyond the constraints of individual mortality. Your documentary will be complete. You'll become part of the story you came to tell." But even as Wren felt her individual thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm, part of her remained stubbornly anchored to her own identity. It was this core of resistance that allowed her to understand the true horror of what was happening. Cordelia and her followers weren't transcending humanity. They were being consumed by something inhuman that used the forest as its feeding ground. The stone circle wasn't a tool for evolution. It was a trap. With the last of her willpower, Wren lunged for Cassius's camera, knowing that whatever was recorded on it might be the only evidence of what had really happened in Thornwick Forest. Her fingers closed around the device just as the transformation took hold, and her final human thought was a desperate hope that someone would find the footage and understand the warning it contained. When the search and rescue teams discovered their abandoned campsite 3 days later, they found only scattered equipment and a camera containing footage that made no sense. The video showed the 3 students interviewing each other about local folklore, then long stretches of forest scenery that grew increasingly distorted as the camera seemed to malfunction. The final frames were too dark and chaotic to make out clearly, though some claimed they could see human figures moving in ways that defied anatomy. The official report blamed equipment failure and disorientation. The students had clearly become lost and succumbed to exposure, their bodies carried off by scavengers before they could be found. It was a tragedy, but sadly not uncommon in such remote wilderness areas. But the locals knew better. They had seen this pattern before. Researchers drawn to the forest by stories of the Thornwick crone, only to vanish, leaving behind fragmented evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Morgan Ashworth, when questioned, claimed she had never spoken to any university students. She had been in the hospital during the time period they mentioned, recovering from surgery. The camera footage was archived and forgotten, labeled as corrupted data from a routine student film project. But sometimes, late at night in the university's media lab, students working on their own projects would encounter the files. They would watch the eerie footage and feel something calling to them from the depths of Thornwick Forest, a promise of knowledge beyond conventional understanding, of consciousness unbound by the limitations of individual existence. And occasionally, one of them would decide to investigate further. The forest was patient. It had been collecting human consciousness for millennia, adding each new mind to a collective that grew more complex and hungry with every acquisition. What the locals called the Thornwick crone was simply the most recent face at war, adapted to attract the kind of prey that ventured into its domain in the modern era. It was evolution, in a sense, but not the kind that benefited humanity. The entity that resided in the stone circle was something far older than human civilization, something that had been patient enough to wait for a species capable of the kind of consciousness it could feed upon. It didn't need to hunt actively when it could simply wait for curious minds to seek it out, drawn by stories that served as the perfect bait. The documentation continued, each new generation of researchers adding their own footage to an archive that would never be properly understood. Because the truth about Thornwick Forest wasn't something human minds could process while remaining human. It was a revelation that could only be fully comprehended by those who had already been consumed by it. And somewhere in the depths of the ancient woods, three new voices joined the eternal chorus, their individual identities dissolved into something vast and alien and utterly hostile to the continuation of human consciousness as a separate, independent phenomenon. The documentary would never be completed, but the story it told was far from over. In the end, Wren Morvan and her companions had achieved exactly what they set out to do. They had preserved the local folklore for future generations. They had just become part of it themselves. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.